The grandchildren, the third generation. What happens then? At about the time that it might have been possible to expect the stirrings of an indigenous American Judaism, the great tragedies and then the great exhilarations of modern Jewish history all take place someplace else. And Jewish identity and Jewish attention is directed very rudely and quite rightly first towards Europe with the rise of the Third Reich and what happened to the Jews in Europe during the war, and then to the Middle East with the establishment of the State of Israel. Which means that the American Jewish community, for almost all of its history as a community, has lived vicariously through other Jews. First through the Jews in the old country that they left behind, and with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, as we know, this has been revived in a kind of American Jewish tourism to the old country. Then, with the, as I say, perfectly understandable perfectly understandable diversion, if you will. It's not a diversion, but focus on what was happening to the Jews of Europe and then what was happening to the Jews in the Middle East. The great challenge for the American Jewish community, and this is going to be my first point, is to consider critically the magnitude of our dependence upon this vicarious form of identity. We cannot always live off the resources of other Jews. We cannot always live off the experiences of other Jews. We may kindle to those other experiences. We may learn from those other resources. But sooner or later, we are going to have to be ourselves as Jews. And this may be happening now owing to generational changes, but we can talk about that. That's my first point. If we're going to have a reckoning in this 350th year, we have to deal with the question of the vicarious character of American Jewish identity. Second point, or second possible explanation, this is a political explanation. And it has to do with what I think is in some ways one of the most alarming developments in Jewish life in our time, and that is the politicization of Jewish identity in our time. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not against politics, God knows. Politics is a high moral imperative when it comes to the safety and the security of Jewries everywhere. Security is also a moral value. This is something that Jews have naturally understood and sometimes has to be reiterated in certain debates. What I'm not speaking about is the illegitimacy of the political focus. I'm speaking about an excess in the political focus of the American Jewish community, so much so that the American Jewish community sometimes strikes me, despite all its internecine divisions and conflicts, sometimes appears as just one big, huge lobby of one kind or another. A people is not a lobby. A culture is not a lobby. A religion is not a lobby. You cannot raise children on a lobby. Now, this politicization, and I'm not going to give many examples because we all know what I'm talking about, this is really what remains of the great age of Jewish ideologies and movements of the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century. That incredibly exciting moment when Jews recovered the historical agency that in some way they had relinquished until then, and all the isms were born. Zionism, assimilationism, territorialism, Yiddishism, reform, and even immigration, which in some way could have been called immigrationism. Because most of Eastern European Jews, when they voted with their feet, came here. They didn't go to the Near East. And that too, immigration too, represented acting on a theory of history and acting on the sense that the individual Jew has the power, the agency to improve his or her lot. This recovery of historical agency has sometimes been called a return to history on the part of the Jewish people. I'm not sure the Jews ever left history, but it is true that it does represent, I think, a kind of surrender to a purely historical way of considering ourselves as a people and as individuals. In the Jewish tradition, the community, as I said earlier, was always one of the central terms of Jewish identity, but it was never the central term, ever. In fact, the kahal, for all that we have glamorized it, in part because we have come to admire Jewish politics almost more than anything else that is Jewish, the kahal was not just an end, it was also a means. It was one of the necessary conditions for the spiritual and cultural and intellectual and religious flowering of individuals and groups within it. Now, just to speak for a moment, just to give one concrete illustration of what I mean by this excessive politicization, we can consider the struggle against contemporary anti-Semitism. There is no question that there has been a resurgence of anti-Semitism in our time. We can debate about the magnitude of it. I'm actually not one of those who think that the village is burning, but nonetheless, there has been some kind of resurgence. And the Jewish community has very remarkably and very typically, I might add, galvanized itself, and rightly, against it. But it is very important to remember, precisely at the time of a resurgent anti-Semitism, that being Jewish is much more than being anti-Jewish. You see, and that the struggle against anti-Semitism, whereas it is a necessary struggle and a noble struggle, must not be installed at the very heart of our identity as Jews. We are not Jews so as to frustrate or exasperate or fight our enemies. Because if that were the case, then the great libel against us, which was perpetrated by Tacitus and by Spinoza and by Sartre and by other people, which is that we are only the products of anti-Semitism, and that if you remove the anti-Semitism, the Jews and Judaism would vanish, that would be true. But in fact, it is not true. One of the first conclusions one learns from the history of the Jews is the remarkable extent to which we were not reduced to our historical circumstances. We never used the persecution or the discrimination that we experienced as a complete explanation for what we did inside our communities. We certainly never referred to the adversity that we experienced as an alibi for any slackening of our own standards for ourselves. And so, as I say, it's very important when one, in this time of, as I say, this necessary renewal of the politics of anti-Semitism, to be very clear that we are not Jews simply to fight the anti-Semites. We are Jews for our own intrinsic, independent, autonomous reasons, and those reasons cannot be reduced to any of the peoples among whom we have lived or to any of the circumstances historically that we have experienced. The third reason for this, and the third reason I think is cultural. And here we get into a dimension, into a purely internal dimension, about which I think our cheshbon should be much more rigorous, much more strict. I think in one particular matter, I think there are grounds for a great collective disgust by ourselves with ourselves. There is no doubt in my mind that the single most decisive factor in the fate of Judaism and Jewishness in America is going to be the Jewish abandonment of Jewish languages in America. This, Hebrew, certainly, but even Yiddish. To my mind, this is the single most important fact about the cultural history of the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community is the first great community in the diaspora that has concluded that it may receive, develop, and transmit the Jewish tradition not in a Jewish language. This has never happened before. There has never, in all the history of our people, ever been such an arrogance on the part of any other Jewish community that it could actually do without any language of its own, but that it could fulfill its tradition and transmit its tradition in the language of other peoples and other cultures.